The Black Cabinet, the Untold Story of African Americans in Politics During the Age of Roosevelt. So there's my email address. So if you have any questions or you want to follow up, you're welcome to email me at any time. I'd be glad to talk with you or write back and forth and answer questions. I kind of outlined it like I would for the class. Can you see this okay? I have to, my screen's kind of there. So I thought I'd organize this by asking some questions and walking you through the overview of the book. I think a lot of you probably haven't had a chance to read it. It's like I haven't have a chance to read it. So, but you don't have to buy it. It's okay, because I'll give you an overview of it. So if you do, I'm grateful. If not, at least this is my chance to help us all remember the Black Cabinet. So, and here's the cover for the book in my shameless effort for self-promotion. But it's at the cover, the artist who did the cover, it's just such a great cover. So I just wanted to pay tribute to her too. So I'm going to talk about what was the Black Cabinet, who composed the Black Cabinet, what their goals were, what they faced as they tried to make positive change, and what were their successes and what were their failures, and then look at an overview of what their main importance is. So that's kind of the direction I'm going to go. So hopefully I won't go on and on and on, and try to keep it pretty concise, hopefully no more than maybe 15, 20 minutes. Is that okay, Raymond? Okay, and at the end, I'll just read a tiny bit, because one of the things I learned about teaching online this semester is don't read a whole lot, because don't talk a whole long, because a whole long period of time, students just kind of lose track. But I think generally our attention spans through the internet are maybe a little bit shorter than when we're seeing each other face to face. So I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. So I thought I'd start here. My whole purpose is to recover the history of the Black Cabinet and tell the story that hasn't been told, and to demonstrate how they're a forgotten generation of activists that provided a bridge between the earlier civil rights leaders in the 20th century, like W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and then the generation that came along with Martin Luther King's. There's sort of a gap between those two major periods in African American activism, and I thought for a long time, well, there can't just be a gap. And then I stumbled onto this and I thought, oh, well, this is the bridge. So last week, somebody said to me, oh, why haven't I ever heard of this? Why didn't anybody tell me about this? And I think it's been largely forgotten for a lot of different reasons, but I started here with this quote from a US history textbook from a college level course. If you look in high school level textbooks, there's nothing about the Black Cabinet, and I don't think there ever has been. In the college level, you get a little brief mention in some textbooks, not a lot. And so here we have a quote from A People in a Nation, which is a great college level textbook. Roosevelt's Black Cabinet, or Black Brain Trust, was unique in US history. Never before had there been so many African American advisors at the White House. So this quote is right. This is pretty much it. Then they list the people, and then they kind of stray off into, well, here's some things that happened. So the Black Cabinet itself is much more important than just a little brief mention. And the thing about this quote, and this is a great textbook, but two things are right and two things aren't right, okay? The first thing that's right is that it was unique. That's absolutely true. And the second thing that's right is never before have you had that level of African-American voices. The thing that is wrong about it is the voices were specifically inside the White House. It was very hard for Black Cabinet members to get to FDR, literally they were blocked. And then it isn't Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. What I want to drive home in the work and in what I have to say is that they were their own Black Cabinet. They assembled themselves into a group to advise FDR. So that's kind of, and Raymond and I were talking about this, they just get these little mentions in textbooks, but they're much more important. So here's a great photo of the Black Cabinet in 1938. and this is the group assembled. It's actually most of the Black cabinet. It was a little bit larger by 38. But this is the kind of core membership of the Black cabinet. By the 1940s, there were a large number of African Americans coming to work in Washington, D.C., and the cabinet just welcomed everybody, so it numbered over 100. So what it was a group of African American advisors who were appointed to federal government programs in the 1930s, specifically in the New Deal agencies. The New Deal is Roosevelt's plan to get the country out of the economic depression. So they come in and they're brought in to advise on the New Deal, to act as a presence within the FDR administration. But the name, the Black cabinet, doesn't come from FDR, and it doesn't come from the administration. It comes from the Black press. They're the ones that identify the assembling of African Americans who are experts. They're social workers. They're professors. They're educators. They're journalists. They're medical doctors. They're experts in their field. They're activists. They come into the New Deal. They slowly begin to trickle in and then begin to grow. So the name comes from the African American press. Why is FDR taking this step, which is different than previous presidents? There's kind of two basic reasons, although it's very complicated. First off, there's pressure from the African American community to bring in African American advisors. Every time a presidency changes, that pressure increases. And secondly, there's pressure within the Democratic Party. In 1932, when FDR ran for president, the Democrats realized that they might be able to recruit African American voters. African American voters, as you know, were voting for Republicans, the party of Lincoln, right? But there's a trickle of voters that come towards the Democrats in 1932. And the idea is if you can bring Black advisors into the federal government, then you might be able to increase support from the African American community and Black voters, not only for Roosevelt, but for the Democratic Party. So let me switch my slides here. So I tell the story by focusing on 5 major figures within the Black cabinet. And I do it as a collective biography because I feel like we experience life as individuals and we experience history as individuals. And to see how these individuals experienced history, to watch their lives start completely far apart and watch them come together and then intersect at this moment in the FDR administration and work together, and sometimes not work very well together, and then depart, go off on their own paths. That's the way I try to tell the story. So the main figures that I focus on, the first is Robert Vann, and Robert Vann was a crusading attorney. He was a journalist. He owned the Pittsburgh Courier, so you can see the Courier's office here. This actually is the Courier's office in Chicago. It had national circulation. Robert Vann was famous for getting people off of death penalty cases. What I mean is by getting people off, helping Black men who were mostly unjustly convicted escape being sentenced to death. So he really is very important before he comes. He receives an appointment in the FDR administration in the summer of 1933. So he's the first African-American advisor to enter the FDR administration. He's important because he is instrumental in leading African-Americans out of the Republican Party into the Democratic Party. And that's in part why he gets his appointment. So I start with Robert Vann. I also focus on Robert Weaver. Robert Weaver is another very early appointment. He's appointed in November of 1933 into an office in the Department of Interior that is specifically focused on African-American issues. He's a Harvard-educated economist. He's the first African-American to receive a PhD in economics from Harvard. So he's a pathbreaker there. And as he works within the Roosevelt administration, he rises to become an expert on jobs and an expert on public housing. So, and you'll see on this, here he is working in his office in the 1940s with the secretary. And here he is in the 1960s when he's appointed as the first Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. He's not only the first Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Lyndon Baines Johnson opens that office in the 1960s. He's the first African-American to serve officially in a White House cabinet. So you can kind of see what his life is like, you know, in the book, from his joining of the Black cabinet all the way to later. I also talk about William Hastie. And William Hastie was a boyhood friend of Robert Weaver. They went to Harvard together, but Hastie studied law, and Hastie is regarded as one of the most brilliant legal minds in the early 20th century. He mentored Thurgood Marshall, who you know is the Supreme Court Justice. So he taught at Howard Law, and he mentored Thurgood Marshall there. He was an attorney for the NAACP and other activist organizations, both before and while he was serving in the federal government. He's also hired into the Department of Interior originally, and he kind of departs government. He comes and goes, but during the war, he's back and he serves in the War Department. So he later on goes on to become the first African-American federal appellate judge, and he'll become the first African-American governor of the Virgin Islands. I know I'm giving you a lot of detail, huh? So hopefully it's interesting and y'all are still with me. Al Smith, who's over here, he's from Arkansas. He grew up poor. He comes to Howard University. He graduates from Howard University. He's an educator and a journalist. And Al Smith comes into the government, and he heads up the largest African-American jobs program in the government. So you can see him here in his office, supervising his secretaries. And he is a very, very unique character. He actually, later in his term, adopts a pseudonym and writes a column where he leaks information from the federal government in order to pressure the government to do the right thing. There she is. The star of all of this is Mary McLeod Bethune. So I know you all know Mary McLeod Bethune, the famous educator, founder of Bethune-Cookman University, the women's club leader, friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. Mary McLeod Bethune comes to Washington as a community advisor in 1935, and she receives an appointment as a New Deal advisor in 1936. And with that, she becomes the first African-American woman to head a federal program. So that's a major milestone. And she, if you know Mary McLeod Bethune, she's as forceful and as indomitable as she is famous, charismatic and dedicated. That's Mary McLeod Bethune. When she gets to Washington, D.C. in 1936, she takes all these guys that are scattered. Here, I'll go back up to my picture here. They're all scattered throughout different agencies in the New Deal. She takes them all and brings them together. She says, we're going to have to work as one. We really need to be a Black cabinet. And unless we work together as one, we're not going to be able to make progress. So that's Bethune. So what were their goals? First, let me say, life in the Great Depression for African Americans was, the Depression was devastating for African Americans. African Americans really never enjoyed the prosperity of the 1920s that we hear about. The Depression had set in for Black Americans long before. In fact, you could argue that the community economically continuously was depressed. The Black community, once the Depression hit, though, was hit harder than the rest of the nation. And we see that trend happening now. We see economically the Black community being hit harder, and then we see in terms of health, the African American community is being hit harder than the rest of the nation. Unemployment in some parts of America in the 1930s ran twice that for Blacks than it did for whites. In some areas, it was as high as 60%. So the New Deal was focusing on getting relief to Americans, But what it was doing right off was just bypassing African Americans, ignoring Black needs. It was the idea that it would help America, but it was only focused on helping white Americans. The cabinet felt that what the New Deal needed to do was bail out all of America, not just white America. And Robert Weaver is very good on this. Robert Weaver says, if you don't address the problems in all American communities, you'll never recover. All communities have to be taken into consideration. The immediate goal was to get fair inclusion in Depression era relief, jobs, education, agricultural relief, all aspects to stop poverty and starvation. And one of their major goals is healthcare. If we had only listened to them then, but they're advocating for universal healthcare back in that period of time. Long-term goals: integration, voting rights, stopping racial violence. They push for anti-lynching legislation. They protest against police brutality. So these are the goals. Now, you know, they're facing an overwhelming racism within American society. The resistance to African Americans in general was enormous. This was Jim Crow America, where the vast majority of African Americans live in the South, and the vast majority of African Americans don't have the vote. Even in Washington, D.C., in the Washington, D.C. setting that they work in, they face that as well. Washington, D.C. is a southern city. When the Black cabinet members come to work in Washington, D.C., they face the same kind of segregation. They face segregated bathrooms. The elevators in some buildings are segregated. When they get there, nobody's provided an office for them. The lower level administrators will say, well, I don't even know why you're here. I don't know what you're doing. Refuse to give them tasks. They encounter hostility throughout the cafeterias. You can't be served at a cafeteria. So they've got kind of dual goals. They're establishing a presence within the federal government, while at the same time they're fighting for equality within the broader system. So what were their, actually, let me show you some photos here. Okay, this one is a very famous Dorothea Lange photo that she took, and the people are standing in a bread line. Well, actually, I think this is a soup kitchen. They're waiting for relief. And then this is another photo of a sharecropping family. That Dorothea Lange was one of the Great Depression era photographers who traveled the country. Sorry about that, she traveled the country taking photographs. So how did they pursue their goals? They pursued their goals two ways. They did open lobbying within the government and within their programs, working together, planning together, pushing their administrators to create, this is a public housing project called the Sojourner Truth Homes in Detroit, pushing the government to live up to the Constitution and treat all Americans equally and give the same kinds of relief to everybody. Uniting together, openly sharing plans and information in their meetings, having conferences, calling people to Washington, compiling data. We wouldn't even as historians know how the Depression impacted African Americans if the Black cabinet hadn't been there, because they were the ones that said, well, we need to separate this out and see how different communities are doing. They compiled that data to prove to these white administrators that indeed African Americans had greater needs, and African Americans were being discriminated against because these white administrators wouldn't believe them. Then there's kind of the covert side of it, where they were kind of working undercover because they faced so much hostility. Their meetings, they met in Mrs. Bethune's home. When I said meetings earlier, they scheduled meetings in Washington, D.C. and called expert-ins. But they often, well, when they were small enough, they met in Mrs. Bethune's home. And then later on, they rented space from the National Women's Club, the African American Women's Clubs. But in the meetings, often they didn't keep minutes. What they talked about went kind of unrecorded. They kind of kept a lot of what they were saying to each other inside because they were worried about jeopardizing their jobs. If they lost their jobs, it meant their voice would be gone. Working with leaders outside in the NAACP, the Urban League, and other activist organizations and churches in order to use them to pressure on the outside for stuff they were pressuring for on the inside. And like I said, leaking information to the press. The Black press was very helpful to them, although sometimes could be very critical of them. And then here you see, I put this up because I wanted you to see that while working within the government, here's Mrs. Bethune, and the woman here is Roberta Hastie. She's William Hastie's mother, and they're picketing a drugstore in Washington, D.C. that refuses to hire African-American clerks, although it's located right within the Black community. So, victories and failures in terms of how close did they come to filling their goals. The smaller victories, they integrated the federal workplace, but even by the end of FDR's administration, there was still hostility. They established a presence. They expanded the presence within the federal service. But there were broader successes. They did secure New Deal relief for agriculture. This is a great photo of a man working on one of the farms that was established by the US government, where you could get a parcel of land and then farm it with a loan and have your own land to farm. And then this is the Civilian Conservation Corps project where African-American youth are being trained in a wood shop. So education, scholarships, federal housing programs. They established a precedent for anti-discrimination clauses in federal government contracts. That's really important because it lays the groundwork for later civil rights legislation. They lead the migration of African-American voters out of the Democratic Party into the Republican Party. They push for better training and better treatment of Black soldiers. What doesn't happen? They don't get anti-lynching legislation. The broader integration of American society doesn't occur. The American military, they wanted it desegregated. That doesn't happen. They also believed that a lot of the New Deal programs had to become permanent, that for poor people, once the Depression was over, taking away job programs and educational support wasn't going to help them. And in a lot of ways, we can kind of see that that's true. Overall, their main, this is African-American defense worker. They're instrumental in getting the government to outlaw discrimination in the defense industry, in defense hiring during World War II. But yet you still find a persistence of Black poverty even at the end of their terms. So the broader impact of the Black cabinet, I think you can see they contributed a lot. I think you can see how they're laying the groundwork for civil rights legislation, for African-American presence in the executive branch. Part of the reason I wrote the book was because I was inspired by Obama. But they helped broaden the philosophy of American government. I don't think anybody's ever given them credit for this. FDR saw his New Deal as an aid relief. It was an economic plan to get the American people out of the Great Depression. And with that, he shifted the philosophy of American government. If you look at the American government in the 20s, under the Republicans, it's anti-regulation of the economy. Federal power shouldn't intervene in any case, pretty much unless it intervenes in the side of business. With FDR, the idea is to harness federal power and intervene and save the economy. Redirect the idea that the government's responsibility is just a business, but its responsibility is to protect all Americans in the time of need, to use federal power to do that. Well, the Black cabinet says that is important. Federal intervention is essential to safeguarding economic rights, right? But it's also important to safeguarding human and civil rights. And so when we get out of the FDR era and when he passes away in 1945, we leave the government in a different place, at least philosophically, that it's not just intervening to save you from the Depression, It's intervening to protect you as a citizen. And that's the benefit of the shift that you see that comes under FDR, a whole new notion that the individual's welfare is intricately tied to the national welfare, but the national welfare is intimately tied to the individual progress. So that kind of gives you a sense of the book overall. So if you don't mind, can I take another minute or two, Raymond? Is that all right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I was just going to read you a short section, unless I've lost you all. Hopefully you're still with me. This is a short section of when Al Smith is probably in some ways the most remarkable of all the Black cabinet members in terms of the things he tries to do. He'll try to do anything to make progress. So this is what Al Smith faces when he first enters his job in spring of 1934. So on his first day, Smith was escorted into an office furnished with only one chair and two tables that were stacked high with thousands of letters from African Americans pleading for aid. Do something with these, he was told. Mrs. Roosevelt had demanded that each receive a personal response. The letters told an anguishing story of Black lives during the Great Depression. An elderly woman in Shreveport, Louisiana wrote, Mr. Roosevelt, dear Colonel and dear Sir, I sit here with borrowed pen, borrowed stamp, borrowed paper, borrowed envelope, and tears in my eyes. There was widespread starvation and death in her community, she testified. Another letter pleaded with the president to send rent money before its writer was out on the streets. I ain't got nowhere to go, so you better hurry up. W.B. Smith, who had a relief job at a Louisiana mill, told of discrimination Black workers faced. Racism was so intense that local officials had assigned guards to protect Black people working on New Deal projects. His federal boss paid out the prescribed wages to Black workers, but deducted rent for uninhabitable lodgings. One of the things that the New Deal programs were doing was they were paying Black workers less than they were paying white workers. And the Black cabinet fought against that, saying, if you allow this at the federal level, then you've institutionalized Jim Crow wages. And so they made some headway with that. Jake Adams of Selma, Alabama, protested the state's practice of ignoring the minimum wage requirement. He made only 10 cents an hour. Please tell me what I'm to do. I will have to have something to take care of my people, wrote Adams. I know the United States government is putting this money out here for us laboring men. This is what the president says. So I'm willing to do my part. That is as far as I'm able, and not willing to work for nothing. When Al Smith looked out the window of his office, he could see across the Potomac where Robert E. Lee's estate stood, with its old slave quarters on the distant hills of Arlington. On nice days, the office was filled with warm afternoon sun, but the view of the Lee plantation, standing as a relic of slavery, the Civil War, and the unreconstructed nation, served as a daily reminder of the gravity of Smith's task. This wasn't a job. It was a fight against the legacy left by enslavement. Al Smith sat down and began answering each letter one by one. So that'll give you a sense of how I'm attempting to tell the story of the Black cabinet through these lives of these remarkable people who came in to serve under the FDR administration. So thank you for letting me talk. And if you have questions, I'm glad.